Arizona mornings are strange things, silent at first, then full of wild possibility. That day, dawn spilled gold over the empty road as Ben Taylor gripped the wheel, racing toward Whispering Pines Sanctuary. His phone had jolted him awake before sunrise, its harsh ring shattering the last fragments of sleep. Now, as the desert rushed past, saguaro silhouettes, red rock shadows, he replayed the words from the night staff again and again. Emergency! 3 bobcat cubs. Mother's gone. They're in bad shape. Ben's father had always claimed that every crisis was a test. Don't let the wild fool you, Ben. It doesn't care about feelings. You stick to the rules or you'll fail them all. Even now, years after his father's death, those words lived in Ben's bones. He was new in his director role, untested, with the legacy of rigid, old-school conservation breathing down his neck. Failure wasn't just a risk. It was a shadow he could never outrun. The sanctuary's gates creaked as Ben's battered truck skidded to a stop. Staff clustered near the intake shed, faces pinched with worry. The desert air was sharp, laced with sun-baked sage and a faint, metallic tang of fear. In a cardboard carrier, tucked under a thin blanket, the cubs huddled together. 3 bundles of ragged fur, ears too big for their heads, eyes wide with terror. "Poachers," whispered Marina, the night manager, her voice brittle. "We found their mother at the canyon's edge. She never had a chance." Ben knelt, heart pounding. The cubs were smaller than he'd expected. Ribs like pencils under matted fur, bellies hollow. One, the tiniest, was barely breathing, sides fluttering with the shallowest breaths. The other 2 pressed against her, silent, as if afraid that any sound might make the world worse. Even among the seasoned staff, no one wanted to meet Ben's eyes. They all knew what orphaned bobcats faced. Without a mother, survival was a cruel long shot. 1,000 thoughts crashed through Ben's mind. Standard rehab said limited handling, no coddling, keep them wild. But these were just babies, living proof that sometimes the rules didn't fit the pain in front of you. "We'll start fluids, warmth, quiet," Ben said, trying to sound steady. Inside, he was anything but. This was the moment, the test he'd dreaded. As he gently lifted the smallest cub, her eyes fluttered open, fixing on his face with a look so raw it hurt. No accusation, just desperate, helpless trust. For a split second, everything else, his father's rules, the staff's anxious stares, the fear of failure, fell away. Ben felt it like a punch. He had to save her, no matter what the book said, no matter what it cost. The sun climbed higher as Ben moved through the motions, IV drips, blankets in the heated incubator, careful notes on each cub's pulse. Marina hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "If they don't eat by tonight." "They will," Ben said, not believing it, not daring not to. He watched the cubs' tiny bodies curled together, fur sticky with dust and blood. Somewhere in the back room, a rescue dog named Daisy whimpered, sensing the tension. Outside, the desert buzzed with indifferent life. As the hours dragged on, the sanctuary settled into uneasy silence. The cubs refused every bottle, flinched from touch, their trust too fragile for human hands. Still, Ben refused to leave. If you were Ben, would you risk your career for a long-shot rescue? The question was no longer hypothetical. It was all that remained. By dusk, the smallest cub's breathing slowed, eyelids fluttering. Ben sat alone beside the incubator, head bowed. He felt the old ache, the pressure of a lifetime spent trying to live up to someone else's impossible standards. Why fight for the lost and wild, especially when the odds were against you? Then, with trembling paws, the little cub reached out, barely clinging to life, and rested her head on Ben's hand. Her eyes met his, full of a silent, desperate plea. "Don't give up on me yet." In that fragile, fleeting moment, hope flickered, thin as sunrise but stubborn as the desert itself. Ben squeezed her paw gently, whispering a promise. He didn't know if he could save them. He only knew he had to try. The Arizona night pressed in, thick with silence and unshed worry. Inside Whispering Pines Sanctuary, lights burned long past closing, painting yellow rectangles across the concrete floors. Ben Taylor sat slouched in the cramped break room, shoulders tight, scrolling through emails with heavy eyes. The soft hum of the incubator echoed from the animal hospital. Every hour, he checked the Bobcat cubs, Patch, Scout, and the smallest, Rascal, hoping for a miracle that refused to come. They wouldn't eat. Not from bottles, not from syringes, not even the warmed kitten formula that sometimes coaxed desperate orphans back from the brink. The other staff tried, one by one, gentle hands and soft voices, but the cubs recoiled from every human touch. It was as if something vital had snapped the night their mother died. Now, no one, not even Ben, could put them back together. He fired off desperate emails to every sanctuary and rehab he could think of, LA, New Mexico, even as far as Texas. The replies trickled in, short and grim. "Most bobcats in this state don't survive without a mother, especially after trauma. Limit human contact, keep them quiet, hope for the best." Even the kindest advice came with a warning: prepare for heartbreak. Ben pressed his palms against his forehead. He couldn't help remembering his father's voice. "Follow protocol, or you'll do more harm than good." Was he doing enough? Was he doing too much? Out in the hallway, the staff gathered, their voices hushed and tense. This wasn't just about 3 cubs. This was about the boundaries everyone else seemed sure of, and the rules Ben was beginning to doubt. He found himself watching Daisy, the big golden retriever rescue who'd lived at the sanctuary for years. She'd lost her own litter just months ago, and now drifted from door to door, searching for something she could not name. Whenever Ben passed by, she nudged his hand and then returned to the animal hospital door, whining softly, as if she felt the pain echoing through those walls. One sleepless hour later, Ben stood in front of the glass, watching the cubs huddle together, too weak even to shiver. Something tugged at him, an idea wild enough to be dangerous. He turned to Marina, who was filling out the daily log. "I think we should try something different." Marina raised an eyebrow, already suspicious. "What do you mean?" "Daisy," Ben said quietly. "She's grieving, and those cubs need comfort. Maybe, just maybe, she could act as a surrogate. If she accepts them, it might give them a reason to fight." Marina froze, pen hovering mid-air. "That's not in any protocol, Ben. If we do this and it fails," he cut her off, voice barely above a whisper. "If we do nothing, they'll die anyway." Word spread quickly through the sanctuary. The senior rehabber, Joel, stormed in, shaking his head. "We can't risk imprinting. They need to stay wild, Ben. We're not running a petting zoo." Ben shot back. "I know what the book says, but the book doesn't have a chapter for this." The staff argued, the old guard versus the new, protocol against hope. Some nodded quietly, eyes drifting to the window where Daisy pressed her nose against the glass, tail thumping, slow and uncertain. In the end, Ben made the call. They prepared Daisy, a fresh bath, clean bedding, a vet check. He carried the 3 cubs in, hands trembling. Daisy sat, ears forward, body tense but still. Ben knelt beside her, laying the cut on the fleece. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Daisy leaned in, nose quivering, and the cubs tensed, eyes wide. The smallest, Rascal, gave a feeble hiss, then collapsed against his siblings. Daisy whined and licked his tiny ear, a mother's instinct resurfacing from somewhere deep. The room held its breath. Daisy curled her body around the cubs, her tail wrapping over them. Patch and Scout whimpered, nuzzling her fur. Daisy began to hum a low, soothing note, the kind only mothers know. The cubs, finally, drank their fill from the bottle, Daisy's steady heartbeat their anchor. Outside, the staff watched in stunned silence. Joel shook his head, but his eyes were wet. Marina wiped a tear, whispering, "Would you risk breaking every rule to give someone a chance at life?" That night, for the first time since their rescue, the cubs slept soundly, Daisy's steady presence a blanket over their fear. Ben sat nearby, jotting shaky notes in his log. Traditional rehab methods failed, but sometimes nature writes its own rules. He looked at Daisy and the cubs, a strange family built from tragedy and hope. The line between wild and home was blurry tonight, but for the first time Ben didn't feel lost. He felt alive. As dawn crept over the horizon, Ben let himself hope. Maybe, just maybe, love could give these wild things a second chance. Night after night, the desert's hush wrapped itself around Whispering Pine's sanctuary. But inside the animal hospital, something extraordinary was unfolding. Time seemed to blur in that dim, antiseptic room. Days bled into nights, each marked only by the soft rise and fall of Daisy's chest as she lay curled around the 3 Bobcat cubs. No alarms, no shouting, just the gentle rhythm of a new family struggling to mend what the world had broken. Ben Taylor lived in a strange state of exhaustion and awe. He barely left the sanctuary now, sleeping in an old recliner just outside the recovery room. Every few hours he'd peer in, careful not to disturb Daisy and her wild wards. Sometimes he'd find Patch, Scout, and Rascal nestled against Daisy's golden fur, twitching in their sleep as if dreaming of their lost mother. Other times, he'd see Daisy licking their ears or nosing them into a tighter circle, mothering with a patience no human could match. One dawn, Ben watched through the glass as Daisy rose, shaking herself awake. She nudged the cubs, urging them toward the warmed formula bottles. Rascal, the smallest and weakest, needed the most help, and Daisy was there every time, guiding him to food, pressing her nose into his side when he wobbled. Bit by bit, the cubs regained their strength, their bellies filled out, fur growing softer, eyes turning brighter and bolder. Still, the staff tiptoed around, as if a single loud sound might shatter this fragile miracle. Joel, the senior rehabber, kept his distance, muttering about boundaries and wild instincts, but even he lingered at the window, drawn by the strange peace that had settled over the room. Ben used the quiet hours to scribble in his journal, something he hadn't done since childhood. Sometimes his entries trailed off into confessions he couldn't share with anyone else, how his own father had never believed in comfort, only survival. Nature's got no room for sentiment, Ben. You'll only make it worse. But as he watched Daisy, he started to question everything he'd been taught. What if love wasn't a weakness? What if, in moments of deepest pain, it was the only thing that could save a wild heart? The cubs began to show small flashes of personality. Patch was the bravest, always first to explore the edges of Daisy's warmth. Scout watched everything, cautious and silent. Rascal, once the sickliest, was the quickest to purr, curling into Daisy's side for hours. They still shrank from human hands, their instincts sharper than any pet's, but with Daisy, they were utterly unafraid. She became their anchor in a world that had flipped upside down. One night, as the cicadas buzzed outside and Ben finished another log entry, a soft thump startled him. He glanced down and saw Patch, the shyest, had crept out from Daisy's embrace. The little cub batted uncertainly at Ben's untied shoelace, green eyes darting up, half playful, half wary. Ben froze, heart in his throat, and let the cub investigate. Patch sniffed, then after a moment returned to Daisy, but not before glancing back at Ben with something like curiosity. Ben wrote in his journal that night, "Love may not be wild, but it can save what's wild." He felt it, deep down. The boundaries between worlds weren't as solid as he'd always believed. Days passed. The cubs grew stronger, braver. Daisy taught them games, how to pounce, how to wrestle, how to nap in a tangled heap. Sometimes she'd roll over, letting all three climb on her belly, their claws kneading, their little growls echoing hers. The sanctuary filled with a new energy, a secret hope that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was happening. Yet for Ben, every step forward brought fresh worries. Would the cubs bond too closely to Daisy, forgetting the wildness they'd need to survive? Was he doing the right thing, or just delaying heartbreak? At night, when the sanctuary was quiet, and the only sound was Daisy's gentle snoring, Ben turned those questions over and over. But every morning, when he saw the cubs alive, eating, playing, when he saw Rascal tackle Scout or Patch chase the shimmer of sunlight, he let himself believe. Word began to spread beyond the sanctuary. Volunteers whispered about the miracle in recovery. Even Joel, ever the skeptic, admitted, "Never seen anything like it." The staff started to relax. Daisy became the sanctuary's heartbeat, her calm steadying not just the cubs, but everyone around her. One afternoon, Marina caught Ben staring at the cubs through the glass, a smile creeping onto his usually worried face. "You did this," she said gently. "You gave them a chance nobody else would have." Ben shook his head, looking at Daisy as she washed Rascal's face. "No, she did. I just broke the rules long enough to let her try." By the end of that week, all three cubs were eating heartily, their coats glossy under the clinic lights. Patch, Scout, and Rascal still flinched at the sound of footsteps or the rustle of a lab coat, but their trust in Daisy never wavered. She was their mother, their anchor, and their bridge to a world they might one day face alone. And as Ben watched Daisy doze, her paws twitching in a dream, he realized that sometimes the wildest thing you can do is open your heart, especially when the world tells you not to. The Arizona heat returned with the turning of the season, baking the red earth and painting every rock and cactus in molten gold. At Whispering Pines Sanctuary, the world outside was stretching awake, and so were the Bobcat cubs. Days that once crawled along in the hush of the recovery room now burst with restless energy as Patch, Scout, and Rascal began exploring the edges of their world, always under the gentle gaze of Daisy. It started small. One morning, Patch pressed his nose against the sliding glass door that separated the hospital from the sanctuary's training yard, peering out with a hunter's curiosity. Daisy, catching the cue, wagged her tail and nudged the door open with her nose. In an instant, Patch slipped out, Rascal and Scout trailing behind, tails high and nervous. Ben watched from a distance, heart thudding with pride and anxiety. This was the moment every rehabber worked toward. That step away from safety, toward the world the animals were meant for. He grabbed a clipboard, pretending to make notes. But really, he was counting every breath, every step. He watched Daisy as she led the cubs around the yard, demonstrating, by example, not words, how to sniff out scent trails, leap over fallen branches, and duck beneath the shade of mesquite trees. The cubs chased insects and pounced on shadows. Patch scrambled up a low log pile, falling more than climbing, while Rascal tried to ambush a butterfly. Scout hung back, his sharp eyes never leaving Daisy. Whenever something spooked them, a car door slamming, the far-off rumble of a tractor, they darted back to her, burrowing in her fur for reassurance. But every time they ventured a little farther, their confidence growing with each foray into the sunlight. For Ben, watching these moments felt like watching a miracle, except miracles, he'd learned, were never simple. Pride warred with fear in his chest. Would the cubs ever be truly wild after this? Or had their bond with Daisy, so tender, so desperately needed, tamed them beyond repair? He remembered his father's warning, echoing from years past. "There's a line, Ben. Cross it, and they'll never make it out there." It wasn't long before the sanctuary's reality, regulations, rules, the ever-present eye of authority, found its way in. One afternoon, a state wildlife inspector arrived for an unannounced check. Ben led her through the facility, tension buzzing in his shoulders. She lingered by the training yard, watching Daisy and the cubs through mirrored sunglasses. "You realize," she said after a long silence, "this kind of bonding can undermine their wild instincts. They're supposed to fear dogs. They're supposed to fear humans. If you overbond them, they might never be candidates for release." Ben's jaw tightened. Their trauma was extraordinary. This bond saved their lives. "Maybe so," the inspector replied, her tone not unkind. "But compassion can be a trap. Don't mistake comfort for rehabilitation." After she left, Ben paced the edge of the yard, replaying her words. He watched as Daisy stretched out under a Palo Verde tree, all three cubs sprawled around her in a patchwork of gold and tawny spots. The sanctuary staff kept their distance, unsure where to stand on the issue. Some cheered Daisy's nurturing. Others worried the line between wild and home had blurred too much. That very night, a new test arrived. As the sun slid behind the mountains, a lone coyote wandered up to the sanctuary's perimeter. The animal, gaunt and desperate, paced the fence, its yellow eyes fixed on the training yard. The cubs, sensing danger, froze. Daisy stood, hackles raised, but she wasn't a fighter. She was a nurturer. Patch surprised everyone. With a growl much bigger than his size, he darted between Daisy and the fence, fur bristling, standing his ground. The coyote, startled by the tiny challenger's audacity, backed off, disappearing into the gathering dusk. For the first time, Ben saw what real wildness looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to protect what you love. That same evening, another quiet milestone unfolded. After a long day of chasing, wrestling, and climbing, Scout, always the most cautious, curled up alone under a sage bush instead of Daisy's side. Ben watched from his office window, breath caught in his throat. Was this the first sign of true independence? He wanted to celebrate, but sadness crept in too. Each step the cubs took away from Daisy brought them closer to the wild, and farther from the strange, beautiful family they had become. In the weeks that followed, the cubs began sleeping apart from Daisy more often, exploring on their own for longer stretches. They honed their hunting instincts, stalking grasshoppers, wrestling over scraps of meat, pouncing on each other with kittenish ferocity. Daisy, for her part, never stopped watching. She'd lie under a tree, head on her paws, eyes tracking every movement. If a cub cried out, she'd be there in a flash. But slowly, she let them roam, her love now a safety net rather than a leash. One evening, as Ben closed the records room, he spotted Daisy at the edge of the yard, watching the sunset. Patch, Scout, and Rascal had wandered off, exploring some new shadow. Daisy's silhouette looked smaller somehow, lonelier. Ben walked over, kneeling beside her. "You did good," he whispered, reaching out to scratch her behind the ear. Daisy sighed, pressing her head into his hand for a brief, grateful moment. She knew, better than anyone, what it meant to love and let go. That night, Ben sat by the training yard, journal in hand, scribbling under the stars. He understood now. Wild roots and tame bonds could exist together, if you let them. The real danger wasn't in loving too much, but in refusing to let love push you, or those you care for, toward the freedom they're meant for. As crickets sang and coyotes howled in the distance, Ben wrote a single line. We cross boundaries for the ones we love, not to tame them, but to give them the strength to return to themselves. The wind was sharp the morning Ben received the email from the Colorado Preserve. He'd been searching for weeks, reaching out to every contact and every sanctuary, hoping for guidance about the next step for Daisy and her 3 Bobcat cubs. The message came through as dawn painted the desert in bruised blue and coral. A short, official note. We can accept the cubs for rewilding. We'll need to begin transition procedures immediately. Daisy cannot accompany them, per protocol. Ben's chest tightened. The cubs, now sleek and wild-eyed, were ready by every measurable standard. They stalked, climbed, fought, and foraged with a ferocity that would make any mother proud. And yet, every evening, as the heat faded, they still returned to Daisy's side, purring and kneading at her fur. For all their wildness, they remained her babies. He called a staff meeting in the cramped conference room. Marina arrived first, concern etched across her face. Joel hovered at the back, arms folded, ready to argue. If we wait too long, Joel warned, they'll never adapt out there. The sooner we separate them from Daisy, the better. Compassion is fine, but it's time for reality. Marina shook her head. You're talking about 3 animals who lost everything before they even opened their eyes. Daisy gave them a reason to live. Ripping them apart overnight could destroy all the progress we made. Ben rubbed his eyes, exhaustion and doubt threatening to crush him. The debate spilled over into the halls, into the outdoor pens, into the break room, where the volunteers whispered about the fate of the miracle family. No one could agree on the right answer. The guidelines were clear. But this situation, as Ben had learned, was anything but. Preparations began. The training yard was split with a chain-link fence. On one side, Daisy paced restlessly, ears pinned back. On the other, the cubs watched her, confusion in their yellow-green eyes. They called for her, their high, reedy mules slicing through the evening hush. Daisy pressed her nose against the fence, whining, tail tucked. She refused her food, staring at the cubs with a heartbreak that was almost human. The cubs fared no better. Patch stopped eating, his once sleek fur growing dull. Scout clawed at the fence, trying to burrow beneath it to reach Daisy. Rascal, smallest and bravest, hurled himself at the metal every night, wailing until his voice gave out. Ben watched helplessly as their progress unraveled. All the wild strength they'd built seemed to wither in the face of their grief. And then the media found the story. A local reporter, young and eager, came to cover Arizona's orphaned bobcats and their unlikely mom. The piece aired that night, complete with slow-motion footage of Daisy licking Patch's face and a shot of Ben, tired and guarded, explaining the challenges. The internet exploded. Viewers argued in comment sections, on forums, and in emails that flooded the sanctuary's inbox. Is this compassion or coddling? Are they saving wild lives or creating pets? The controversy spread farther than Ben ever imagined, even reaching animal welfare panels and state regulators. Ben felt the scrutiny like a physical weight. For every message of support, there were 2 more accusing him of playing God, or risking the cub's future for the sake of a heartwarming photo. Joel started keeping a stack of critical letters on his desk, reading them aloud at staff meetings. Marina tried to shield Ben from the worst, but the pressure seeped into every moment. Even Daisy seemed to sense the shift, her energy growing listless as the days dragged on. Through it all, Ben was haunted by guilt. He walked the fence line at night, torn between the desperate wails of the cubs and the weary silence of Daisy. He remembered the first night they arrived, how hopeless he'd felt, and how Daisy's love had changed everything. Was he really supposed to rip it all away now, just because the rules demanded it? One evening, as Ben made his rounds, he found Daisy curled by the fence, her favorite plush toy, a faded stuffed fox, clamped between her teeth. With slow, deliberate care, she pushed the toy through the wire, nudging it toward Patch. The cub sniffed, then pressed his head against the mesh, comforted by the familiar scent. It was a small gesture, but to Ben, it felt like an act of grace, a reminder that love, even at a distance, could reach across any boundary. That night, Ben made a decision. He pulled out his phone and recorded a video, speaking directly to everyone who had followed their journey. He spoke of the science, the protocols, and the hard choices, how nothing in the manual could account for what Daisy had given the cubs. He admitted his doubts and his fears, but also his belief that survival was about more than instinct. It was about connection. The next morning, as staff and volunteers gathered to watch, Ben uploaded the video. It went viral within hours. Suddenly, the story was bigger than Whispering Pines. Wildlife experts, veterinarians, and regular people from across the country began weighing in. Some called for compassion, others for strict protocol. The debate raged, but something changed in the air. For the first time, people saw the cost of the choices made in the name of doing what's right. As the sun set on another long, uncertain day, Ben sat beside Daisy, running his hand along her golden fur. "We'll find a way," he whispered. "I promise." Across the fence, the cubs watched, waiting. The distance between them was cruel, but hope, Ben realized, could cross even the highest barriers. The air inside Whispering Pines was heavy, thick with worry and restlessness. No one could remember the last time they'd slept through the night. Ever since the separation, Daisy's mournful whines and the cubs' anxious pacing haunted the corridors. Food bowls went untouched. Play toys lay ignored. The sanctuary, once alive with hope, felt smothered by uncertainty. Then, just after midnight, chaos erupted. The security alarm's harsh beep jolted Ben from an uneasy sleep in his office. He ran out, heart pounding, staff scrambling beside him. A single camera blinked red. The outdoor training yard's gate, somehow, had been opened. Frantic barking and high, desperate mewls echoed through the compound. Ben and Marina reached the yard first. The scene was pure pandemonium. Scout, boldest of the cubs, had managed to pry up a panel at the fence's base. Now all three bobcats squeezed through, running straight into Daisy's waiting embrace. Daisy wagged her tail wildly, licking their faces as they pressed against her. A family knit back together by desperation. Patch was purring so loudly, Ben could hear it from across the yard. For a brief, shining moment, everything else fell away. The cameras, the rules, the crushing outside judgment. All that remained was the reunion, raw and beautiful. But then reality crashed back in. Flashlights bobbed in the dark as more staff arrived. Joel barked orders, his voice shaking with anger. "We have protocols for a reason. You've crossed every line, Ben. This is going to cost us everything." The sanctuary's board convened a formal review before sunrise. They grilled Ben, Marina, even the volunteers. The local press showed up, snapping pictures of Daisy curled around the cubs, making it impossible to contain the story. Ben's inbox overflowed with furious messages from state officials, wildlife authorities, and other sanctuaries. The internet was on fire, some calling Ben a hero, others demanding he be fired for what they called reckless sentimentality. At the review, Ben stood alone before the board, a half-circle of tired, frowning faces. He spoke plainly, voice hoarse but steady. "I won't lie to you. We broke protocol, but protocol didn't save those cubs when they first arrived. Daisy did. Every expert said they had no chance. We did what we had to because survival is more than following the rules. It's about giving them something to fight for." Joel interrupted. "And if they fail out there? If this bond makes them too tame?" Ben's jaw tightened, but he met Joel's gaze. They were already lost. Daisy gave them hope. I stand by what we did. The board members murmured, divided. Some pressed for Ben's removal. Others, moved by his honesty and by the public outpouring, urged patience. The meeting stretched until sunrise, everyone's nerves fraying. Just when it seemed nothing would break the stalemate, Marina rushed in, waving her phone. "It's the Colorado Preserve," she said breathlessly. "They saw the story. They've changed their position." The boardroom fell silent as she read the message aloud. "Given the extraordinary circumstances and the bond observed, we propose a pilot program. Bring Daisy with the cubs. We'll attempt a gradual separation plan supervised by our senior behaviorists. We want to see if your compassion and their wildness can coexist." For a long moment, no one spoke. Ben felt tears sting his eyes, relief and gratitude mixing with disbelief. Against every odd, a door had opened. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Ben oversaw the preparations himself, working alongside volunteers and staff to secure transport, gather records, and ensure the cubs and Daisy's health. The story hit national news. Sanctuary breaks the rules and may change conservation forever. Journalists called non-stop, and animal welfare groups debated the meaning of the sanctuary's gamble. On their final night at Whispering Pines, Ben found Daisy and the cubs curled up in the training yard, their breathing slow and even beneath the desert stars. He sat with them, running his hand along Daisy's back, whispering gratitude and promises. "You're braver than any of us, you know that?" Daisy opened her eyes, nuzzling his hand as if to reassure him that somehow everything would work out. Before dawn, the sanctuary staff and a few close supporters gathered by the main gate. Daisy's crate stood open beside a larger carrier for Patch, Scout, and Rascal. The cubs, wary but trusting, followed Daisy in without protest. Ben closed the doors gently, then pressed his forehead against the bars, breathing in the musky, wild scent of the family he'd risked everything for. The caravan pulled away as the first light streaked the sky. Ben stood in the dust, watching until the last car disappeared down the road. His heart ached with loss, but also with pride. He'd done what he believed was right, even when it meant breaking the mold. The future was uncertain, the risks real, but hope traveled with Daisy and her cubs into the unknown. Back inside, Ben sat at his desk, the sanctuary strangely quiet. He opened his journal and wrote a single line. "Sometimes the wildest thing you can do is trust love to finish what science began." He closed his eyes, knowing that for Daisy, the cubs, and himself, a new chapter was just beginning. The long drive northward was quiet, the desert landscape giving way to the rugged, pine-laced foothills of Colorado. Daisy and the 3 Bobcat cubs huddled close in their travel crates, lulled by the movement and the familiar scent of one another. By the time they arrived at the Colorado Preserve, the air was crisp and cool, mountains ringed with wildflowers, and the smell of spruce sharp as a promise. Ben stepped out of the van first, his heart thumping with nerves. The Colorado team greeted him with wary optimism. A senior behaviorist named Dr. Ellis shook his hand, her eyes lingering on Daisy and the cubs with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "We're making history here, Mr. Taylor. No pressure, right?" He offered a crooked smile. Just another day in wildlife rehab. The new enclosure was unlike anything Daisy or the cubs had seen before. Sprawling meadows, rocky outcrops, stands of tall pines, all wrapped in high, predator-proof fencing. It was built to be as wild as possible, while still letting the staff observe every move. As the crates opened, Patch, Scout, and Rascal stepped out together, low and cautious, their bodies pressed close to Daisy's side. She gave them a reassuring nudge, tail wagging slowly. The first few days, Daisy remained their shadow. She followed them everywhere, her golden coat standing out against the russet earth as she watched their every move. The staff set a careful schedule. Daisy would stay with the cubs during the day, but spend nights in her own shelter, slowly lengthening the periods apart. At first, the cubs cried and searched for her, but each morning they were a little bolder, a little less afraid. Ben spent hours observing from the other side of the glass. He saw the subtle changes, the way Patch began stalking grasshoppers in the tall grass, how Rascal tested the rocky ledges, how Scout would disappear into the shadows, returning with twigs tangled in his fur. Daisy watched each milestone with maternal pride, but she also seemed to know when to let go, settling in the sun nearby, her presence a steady beacon. A turning point came on the 6th day, when a group of school children visited the preserve. Among them was a young boy named Mateo, quiet and withdrawn, his parents explaining that he was on the autism spectrum and often struggled to connect. As the group watched from behind the glass, Daisy approached and sat down by the fence, her tail thumping gently. Rascal, ever the most curious, padded over and pressed his nose to the wire. Mateo crouched on the other side, eyes wide, silent tears on his cheeks. Slowly, he reached out a trembling hand, and Rascal mirrored the gesture with a soft chirrup. For a long, breathtaking moment, Boy and Bobcat simply watched each other, Daisy gazing on with her deep, knowing eyes. Dr. Ellis made a note, whispering to Ben, "We're seeing something remarkable here. Connection isn't just healing the animals, it's changing us too." Inspired, the preserve launched a new educational initiative, Bridges Not Walls, a program pairing animals with children who had experienced trauma or struggled with connection. Daisy and the Bobcats became its ambassadors. News crews returned, not to criticize but to celebrate. The controversy faded, replaced by stories of hope. As weeks passed, Daisy began stepping back. The staff reduced her visits, and while the cubs missed her at first, their independence flourished. Patch, once the most timid, stalked and killed his first mouse alone, an essential milestone for any wild cat. Ben watched through tears as Daisy, separated by the fence, sat quietly, eyes shining with a strange, satisfied pride. The staff celebrated. Dr. Ellis nodded. He's ready for the next step. "You were right, Ben. The bond didn't break them. It made them strong." Scout soon followed, taking to the trees and higher rocks, vanishing for hours only to return with burrs stuck in his fur and triumph in his eyes. Rascal, always the heart of the trio, grew more playful, engaging with visiting children and sanctuary volunteers, teaching everyone that wildness and gentleness could live side by side. For Daisy, the transition was bittersweet. She took her cues from the cubs, greeting them with a gentle nuzzle before turning away, trusting them to stand on their own. In the evenings, she'd watch from a shaded spot, content just to see them thrive. Ben found himself sitting beside her often, his arm around her shoulders, both of them watching the wild family grow. The Preserves program was soon cited at conferences and in articles, hailed as a model for interspecies healing and compassion-based rehabilitation. Letters poured in from around the country, rehabbers, teachers, parents, sharing stories of hope inspired by Daisy and her bobcats. One sunset, as golden light spilled over the meadows, Patch led his siblings on a hunt, moving through the grass with a grace that was pure bobcat. Daisy watched from the edge, her tail thumping softly. Mateo and his parents stood nearby, watching too, the boy's face alight with joy. Ben glanced at Dr. Ellis, who smiled. "You didn't just save them, Ben. You changed the way we think about saving anything." Ben watched the cubs disappear into the tall grass, no longer tethered by fear. He turned to Daisy, who gave a satisfied sigh and rested her head in his lap. Together they sat in the fading light, two survivors, two healers, and now two friends at peace with the boundaries they'd crossed. A year slipped by at the Colorado Preserve, measured in subtle triumphs and small farewells. Spring came early, bringing wildflowers to the meadows and fat mice for hunting. Patch and Rascal adapted quickly to the life the wild demanded, learning to disappear into the trees, sometimes not returning for days at a time. Daisy grew older, moving with a more careful gait, but still visited the boundary fence most afternoons to watch her bobcats sun themselves or stalk the grass. Scout, always the most independent, had truly flourished. His hunting skills became the stuff of stories among the staff. He could vanish into the brush and return with a rabbit, proud and wild-eyed. Ben kept track of them all in his weathered notebook, visiting the preserve whenever his schedule allowed. He took quiet satisfaction in how each of the cubs had found their own way, drawing strength from Daisy's lessons, yet living according to their own instincts. But late that summer, an ominous hush settled over the preserve. It began with Scout's absence. At first, no one worried. It wasn't unusual for a healthy bobcat to avoid the trails and observation points for days at a stretch. But as a week passed with no sign, staff grew anxious. Daisy lingered by the woods longer each day, her posture tense, occasionally letting out mournful yips that echoed at dusk. The search began in earnest. Dr. Ellis led teams of keepers, combing the far reaches of the preserve, following tufts of fur and faint tracks through the undergrowth. Ben arrived, worry clawing at his insides. They found Scout at last, hidden deep in a tangle of wild rose and fallen pine, listless and glassy-eyed. His breathing was ragged, his coat matted and dull. The vet, Dr. Yates, rushed in and diagnosed a severe respiratory infection, worsened by dehydration and stress. Scout's feral nature was now his biggest obstacle. He recoiled from human hands, lashing out when they tried to approach. Every attempt to feed or medicate him ended in growls and desperate retreat. Even Patch and Rascal, brave in other ways, watched helplessly from the brush, unable to coax their brother back toward help. Ben sat outside the isolation pen, torn in ways he'd never expected. All his training screamed that wild animals needed distance, that overstepping that line could mean disaster. But as he watched Scout suffer, his resolve wavered. Dr. Ellis shook her head, her face lined with concern. "We may lose him. We can't get close enough. He's shutting down." It was Daisy who finally broke the impasse. As if sensing Scout's pain through some invisible tether, she paced the fence, whimpering softly. Ben, recalling the miracle she'd worked so long ago, made a bold suggestion. "Let Daisy try. If anything can reach him, it's her." The staff hesitated. Rules about cross-species contact were strict, even now. But desperation and memory won out. They opened the gate to Scout's enclosure, and Daisy trotted in, slow and careful, tail low and eyes full of gentle purpose. At first, Scout hissed, his body taut with pain. Daisy didn't flinch. She settled a few feet away, laying her head on her paws, waiting. Inch by inch, as hours passed, she crept closer, humming low in her throat, the same sound she'd used to calm him as a cub. By dusk, she was curled around him, licking his ears, her nose pressed into his fur. Scout let out a low, broken mewl and rested his head against her side. The staff and Ben watched from a respectful distance, breath held. For the first time in days, Scout accepted a bit of food, only when Daisy offered it, gently pushing it toward his muzzle. She stayed with him all night, and in the morning, Scout managed to drink water. Over the next days, his strength began to return. The infection loosened its grip, and Scout's eyes regained their familiar wild spark. Word of Daisy's healing presence spread through the preserve and beyond. Staff members who had once doubted Ben's choices found themselves moved, seeing with their own eyes the power of a bond that crossed species and broke every rule they'd once held sacred. The preserve's protocol committee gathered, reviewing every step of Scout's recovery. Dr. Ellis, usually so strict, shook her head in wonder. There's something here science can't explain. Sometimes love really is the missing medicine. They updated their guidelines, formally allowing supervised animal surrogacy in cases of trauma or severe distress, the Daisy Clause, as some began to call it. Articles appeared in national journals about the case, and other sanctuaries reached out for advice. Daisy and Scout's story was featured on a popular wildlife program, the footage of their reunion making viewers across the country cry. For Ben, the experience was humbling. He saw that, in a world so obsessed with boundaries, sometimes healing required the courage to cross them. Science and rules mattered, but so did compassion, trust, and the willingness to let animals teach us how to care. By autumn, Scout was stronger than ever, back to roaming with his siblings, his bond with Daisy no longer one of dependency, but of gratitude. A living bridge between two worlds. As the aspens turned gold and the mountain winds grew brisk, Ben walked the preserve's trails with Daisy by his side, reflecting on all that had happened. The old rules were still there, but now they were tempered with understanding, a recognition that wildness and love could both belong, even in the most unexpected places. Years passed. Whispering Pines Sanctuary was quieter now, but Ben Taylor's name had become a touchstone in the world of wildlife rehabilitation. What started as an experiment born out of desperation had become a new way of thinking, a debate that reached conference halls, academic journals, and dinner tables across the country. Ben adjusted his tie in the mirror of a hotel bathroom, feeling a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with public speaking. The National Wildlife Rehabilitation Conference was the biggest gathering of its kind, a place where scientists, students, veterinarians, and passionate amateurs came together each year to argue, teach, and learn. For the first time, Ben had been invited to deliver a keynote address. The topic was simple, but the weight was enormous: compassion and science, bridging the divide. Outside the auditorium, hundreds of faces waited, some curious, some skeptical, all eager to hear what the man who'd broken the rules could teach them. Ben took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. Behind him, a giant screen flickered to life, displaying a montage. Daisy curled around 3 trembling cubs, the cubs stalking through Colorado meadows. Patch's first wild kill. Rascal's playful leaps. Scout's recovery in Daisy's arms. He started not with statistics or theory, but with the story. When those cubs arrived, everything I'd learned told me to keep my distance, to let nature take its course. But what I saw was suffering that couldn't be measured with a clipboard or a stopwatch. I saw 3 wild lives on the edge, and I saw a dog, a mother without her own pups, who refused to walk away. The room was silent, every eye locked on Ben. He spoke plainly, confessing doubts he'd never said aloud. For most of my life, I saw the wild and the domestic as opposites. I thought one needed rules, and the other needed love. But Daisy and those bobcats taught me that real healing often means crossing boundaries we're taught to fear. He explained the protocols and the science, why rules mattered, why they existed. He acknowledged that rigid adherence kept animals safe, that releasing pets into the wild or overhandling orphans could cause lifelong harm. But, he said, when those rules become a shield against empathy, they fail the very creatures we are trying to save. Ben clicked the remote, and images flashed by. Daisy and Patch. Daisy licking Scout's fevered head. The cubs stalking the shadows as Daisy watched from a distance. The world told us this bond would ruin their wildness. Instead, it gave them the courage to survive trauma and return to themselves. When Scout fell ill, medicine failed him, but love, Daisy's love, brought him back. I can't explain it all, but I can tell you what I saw. There were murmurs in the crowd, some nodding, some furrowing brows. Ben pressed on, feeling the old nerves dissolve into conviction. The real purpose of conservation isn't just survival. It's about giving every creature a chance to heal, to connect, to belong. Science and protocol must guide us, but compassion must be allowed to challenge us. He read aloud messages from sanctuaries and families across the country. A rehabber in Minnesota who tried a cross-species surrogacy after reading Ben's case study. A mother whose autistic son found his voice while visiting Daisy and the cubs. A scientist who admitted he was once a skeptic, but now saw the value in letting love guide the hard decisions. Boundaries matter, Ben concluded, but the heart's needs are universal. Interspecies love is not a weakness. It's a resource science is only beginning to understand. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. What if we could build a world where rules keep us safe, but empathy lets us heal? What if we trusted that the wildness in every creature, ourselves included, can survive, even thrive when given a bridge of kindness? The audience rose in a standing ovation, some dabbing at their eyes, others shaking their heads in wonder. Ben stepped down from the podium, suddenly at peace with every risk he had taken. He found Dr. Ellis and Marina in the crowd, both grinning with pride. After the applause faded, students and old-school rehabbers alike approached him, asking questions, sharing stories. Some still doubted, some disagreed, but many more wanted to learn. Ben stayed long after the conference ended, listening to tales from across the country, of orphaned foxes adopted by old barn cats, of trauma-scarred hawks calmed by therapy dogs, of boundaries crossed and hope restored. Back in his hotel room that night, Ben pulled out his journal. He wrote about the journey, about the cubs who survived, about Daisy's gift, about the lessons learned in the wild and at home. He thought about the next generation of animal lovers, scientists, and caretakers, what he wanted them to remember. Don't let fear keep you from crossing the line when compassion calls. Be brave enough to question the rules and humble enough to honor them. In the end, the real wildness isn't out there. It's in the courage to do what's right, even when the world says you're wrong. As he closed his notebook, Ben felt something settle deep in his chest, a sense of closure and a powerful new beginning. Daisy's story, the cub's journey, and his own risks had changed more than a handful of lives. They had shifted the ground on which the future would be built. The road back to the Colorado Preserve always felt like a pilgrimage for Ben Taylor, a chance to reconnect, to remember, and to witness how the world can change when the heart leads the way. Years had passed since the day Daisy and her bobcats first arrived here. The sanctuary itself had grown. New enclosures, new staff, new stories born from the seeds of hope Daisy had sown. It was autumn now, the air crisp and the aspen leaves gold as coins. Ben parked under the same towering pines, grabbed his old notebook, and followed the winding trail to a clearing where sunshine spilled like honey. Daisy was there waiting. Her muzzle had gone silver, her steps slower, but her eyes still shone with a wisdom that had weathered every storm. Sometimes the bobcats, full-grown and regal, appeared in the distance, melting in and out of the wild grass, watching over her as she had once watched over them. Ben sat beside Daisy, feeling the warmth of her body against his leg. They watched in companionable silence as Patch, Scout, and Rascal prowled the edge of the preserve, sometimes together, sometimes apart. Every now and then, one of them would pause, look back at Daisy, and flick their tail in a gesture that said, "I remember." Daisy would wag her tail in reply, a silent, enduring bridge between worlds. He reflected on all that had changed. The once controversial experiment had become standard practice in dozens of sanctuaries across the country. The Daisy model, some called it, referencing protocols that blended strict science with compassion and creativity. New staff arrived every season, eager to learn not just the rules, but the reason for the rules. Ben had become something of a mentor, less the nervous rookie and more the wise guide, passing on the lessons that Daisy and the bobcats had taught him. That afternoon, Ben led a group of school children and new volunteers down the trail. He told the story, how the world's boundaries, wild and tame, old and new, weren't walls, but living bridges. Sometimes, he said, the right choice isn't in the book. It's in the moment, in the courage to care even when you're afraid of making a mistake. The children listened wide-eyed as Daisy pressed her head into Ben's lap, as if agreeing with every word. He spoke of mistakes and risks, of nights he lay awake with guilt or fear. He told them how rules keep us safe, but empathy lets us heal. If you want to save lives, you have to be willing to risk your reputation, your comfort, even your beliefs. Animals teach us that every day. One of the young volunteers asked, "Do you think Daisy and the bobcats ever really understood each other?" Ben smiled, watching as Patch crept close to Daisy, dropping a feather at her paws. "I think they understood more than we ever could. They needed each other, and that need built a bridge that neither time nor distance could break." Ben found himself talking about leadership, the kind that listens before commanding, that adapts instead of controlling. Real leadership in this work, he said, means trusting connection, even across species. Sometimes the best thing you can do for the wild is let love be part of your science. Later, as the group dispersed, Ben wandered to the edge of the preserve where the tall grass met the tree line. He watched as Patch, Scout, and Rascal slipped into the shadows, moving with the ease and confidence of animals who had survived the unimaginable and who had found their way back to themselves. Daisy sat beside him, head resting on his knee, her breath slow and even. He thought of all the letters he'd received over the years, stories from sanctuaries trying their own Daisy model, from families who'd found hope through animals, from scientists who once doubted but now advocated for a new kind of compassion in their work. He thought of children like Mateo, who had found connection with Rascal and discovered that love, too, could be wild. The sun began to set, bathing the world in a coppery glow. Ben reached down, rubbing Daisy's ears, feeling the bones beneath her old, soft fur. "You changed everything," he whispered. Daisy thumped her tail, leaning into his touch one last time. As the shadows deepened, the bobcats drifted off into the brush, disappearing but never lost. Ben stood and took a deep breath of mountain air, feeling for the first time in years a sense of completion. The story wasn't just about animals. It was about all of them, about longing for connection, about the courage to cross boundaries, about the beauty found in difference. He walked back toward the main building, passing the next generation of staff and students gathered on the porch. He sat with them as dusk fell, sharing stories of Daisy and the cubs, passing on the message that mattered most. In every act of kindness, we build a world that's less divided, a world where healing is not just survival, but the restoration of hope and belonging. If Daisy and the bobcats have moved you, remember, true compassion sometimes means breaking the mold. Don't be afraid to reach across the boundaries in your own life, for you might save more than you know. As the last light faded and the stars blinked awake, Daisy nestled close, her breathing soft, her body finally at rest. Ben pressed his hand to her side, feeling her heartbeat, steady, strong, and undiminished by age. For a moment, all was silent. The past and future folded into this single, perfect piece. The legacy of love, courage, and wildness would endure. In every animal released, in every rule reconsidered, in every life changed by the simple act of reaching across what divides us. The story was never just about wild things. It was about the wild hope in every heart.